The object that came back was the size of a fist. That was the first thing Archivist Prime Solon noticed when the recovery team laid it on the examination table. Not the composition readings, not the trajectory analysis, not the fact that it had traveled 11 light-years through open vacuum to arrive at precisely this station, at precisely this time. Just the size of it. A fist. The greatest military fleet the Convergence had assembled in 400 years. 712 warships carrying 140,000 soldiers across 3 species. And what came back fit inside a fist? It was warm. That was the second thing. After 11 light-years of interstellar cold, the object was warm, as if someone had just set it down. Solon did not touch it. She stood at the edge of the table and stared at it and felt the first tremor of something she had not felt in a very long time. The room was full of scientists and military officials, and they were all talking at once, filling the air with measurements and hypotheses, but she heard none of it. She was looking at the thing's surface, at the markings pressed into it. She recognized the markings. That was the third thing, and that was the thing that made her sit down. The fleet had launched 14 months ago with complete confidence. This was not arrogance, to be clear. The Convergence did not deal in arrogance. Arrogance implied emotional bias distorting rational calculation, and the Convergence prided itself, above all else, on rational calculation. What the fleet launched with was something more dangerous than arrogance. It launched with certainty. Mathematical, cross-verified, triple peer-reviewed certainty that the species designated H7 humans. They called themselves. A sound like something being torn posed no credible military threat at their current stage of technological development. The assessment had been thorough. 18 years of orbital observation. Passive signal interception going back 40 years before that. Detailed analysis of their weapons, their propulsion systems, their biology, their recorded conflicts with one another. The Convergence's military strategists had modeled every conceivable scenario in which H7 resisted the territorial consolidation order, and in every single model, every one, the outcome was the same. Compliance within 60 days, minimal casualties, absorbed without significant incident. Solon herself had co-authored the risk assessment. She remembered the final line she had written. No evidence of any strategic capability capable of threatening a sustained Convergence military presence. She looked at the object on the table now and thought about that line. Archivist Prime. The voice belonged to Fleet Coordinator Davin, who was standing across the table from her with his hands clasped behind his back and his face arranged in an expression that was trying very hard to be composed. You recognize the markings. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said. What are they? They're mine, she said. I pressed them into the hull of the command ship myself when I saw it off at departure. It's a Convergence good luck tradition. Old one. I didn't think. She stopped. She looked at the object. I didn't think anyone outside my office knew about it. So this came from the command ship's hull, Davin said. From the outermost plate of the command ship's hull, yes. Someone cut it off, he said. Someone cut it off, she agreed, and sent it back. The room was quiet for a moment, not because everyone had stopped talking, but because the weight of what she had just said had settled over the conversation and pressed it flat. Archivist Prime, said one of the younger analysts from the far corner, barely containing the tremor in his voice. If they cut this from the command ship's hull, what does that tell us about where the command ship is now? Nobody answered him, because everyone already knew, and knowing it was not the same as being willing to say it out loud. Solon spent the first 3 hours after the object's arrival in the data archive, pulling everything the Convergence had collected about humanity in the last 2 years. The period after the consolidation order had been issued, the period during which the fleet was in transit. She was looking for something she had missed. Some capability, some preparation, some strategic development that the models had failed to account for. She found the first thing almost immediately, and it made no sense. 6 weeks before the fleet arrived at the human system, long-range sensors had detected unusual activity around the third planet. Not military activity, agricultural activity. Humans were, in the middle of an impending alien invasion, planting crops. Enormous quantities of crops, more than their population would need for several growing seasons. The original analyst who had flagged it had dismissed it as irrational panic behavior consistent with prey-species threat response. She had added a note. Subjects appear to be comfort farming in the face of existential threat. Solon stared at this note for a long time. Then she moved on. The second anomaly was stranger. In the weeks immediately following first contact, the moment when the advanced scout ships had appeared at the edge of the human system and transmitted the consolidation order, human communication traffic had done something unexpected. Rather than fragmenting, as every behavioral model predicted it would, as every prey-species communication network fragmented under existential threat, it had consolidated. The hundreds of independent political entities on the human homeworld had begun talking to each other at a rate and volume that had no precedent in their recorded history. The analysts had flagged this too and dismissed it too. Attempting coalition formation will not achieve coordination before fleet arrival. Timeline incompatible with effective resistance preparation. Solon looked up from her screen. She looked at the little warm object on the examination table across the room. Timeline incompatible with effective resistance preparation. Davin, she said quietly. He appeared in the doorway. Yes. The analyst assumed the humans were trying to coordinate military resistance. That's correct. That was the assessment. What if they weren't coordinating military resistance? He was quiet for a moment. What were they coordinating then? I don't know yet, she said. That's the problem. The account that follows is assembled from 3 sources. The long-range sensor logs of the outer picket ships, the ones stationed far enough from the engagement to survive it, the partial transmission records recovered from 3 separate comm buoys the fleet had deployed at different stages of the approach, and the single personal log recovered from the wreckage of the scout ship Relentless Calculation Asterisk, which had apparently survived longer than anything else. The log belonged to a junior tactical officer named Vassar Wren, and it covered approximately 19 days of the engagement before it was abruptly cut off. Not corrupted, not destroyed, cut off. Mid-sentence, mid-word, as if someone had simply reached over and pressed a finger to the recording. What follows is Solon's attempt to reconstruct the sequence of events. She began this reconstruction 3 days after the object's arrival. She finished it 11 weeks later, in a different room, alone, with all the lights off. The fleet arrived at the human system on schedule and in perfect formation. This part was confirmed by the outer picket logs. 712 ships crossing the outer boundary of the system in a dispersal pattern that had been optimized over 4 centuries of convergence tactical development. It was a beautiful formation, by any mechanical measure. It implied overwhelming force while simultaneously signaling restraint, a way of saying, we can destroy everything here, and we are choosing not to, and this choice is itself a demonstration of power. Signal received from planet surface, reported the communications officer aboard the flagship. They're responding to the consolidation order. Fleet Admiral Murrath, commanding, had leaned forward slightly. This was the moment in every consolidation engagement when prey-species governments either collapsed immediately or made the inevitable token resistance before collapsing. Either way, the outcome was the same. What are they saying? Murrath asked. The communications officer was quiet for just a fraction too long. Sir, she said, they're saying they've been expecting us. That phrase, we've been expecting you, appeared 3 times in the first 2 hours of communication. It appeared in transmissions from the political leadership, from their military command, and peculiarly, from a civilian communication channel that appeared to be some form of public broadcast. They were telling their entire population that the fleet had arrived, not hiding it, announcing it, as if the fleet's arrival was not a catastrophe but an appointment being kept. Murreth filed this under asterisk psychological bluffing and continued the approach. The second unusual event occurred 6 hours later as the fleet moved into the inner system. Human ships appeared. Not many, 43 vessels by the sensor count, a laughably small number against 712, but they didn't behave the way the models predicted. They didn't form a defensive line. They didn't position themselves between the fleet and the planet. They spread out, thin and wide and strange, like a net or like fingers, and then they went very still and waited. "They're not moving to intercept," said the tactical officer. "No," said Murreth slowly, "they're not. Sir, their weapons are active but not aimed. They're just holding position." "What are they waiting for?" Nobody answered because nobody knew, and that small not knowing was the first crack in the certainty the fleet had launched with. It was small. It was easy to dismiss. Murreth dismissed it. He ordered the fleet to continue. Solon paused in her reconstruction here at this moment and made a note in the margin of her working document. Why spread out? What purpose does spreading out serve against a force of this size? What are they measuring? What are they looking for? She didn't answer the question yet. She came back to it later. 3 times she came back to it before the answer arrived, and each time the answer seemed worse than the last. The first time she came back to it, she thought, "They're mapping our fleet's disposition. Standard intelligence gathering, nothing unexpected." The second time she came back to it, she thought, "No, the spread is wrong for that. They're not mapping the fleet. They're mapping something else. The system, their own position relative to something." The third time she came back to it, sitting alone with the lights off, she thought, "They were mapping our approach vector. They were calculating exactly how we would enter, not to block us, to ensure we came in a specific way." She sat with that thought for a very long time. Then she wrote, "The 43 ships were not a defense. They were a guide." On day 3 of the engagement, the fleet encountered its first military resistance, and it was exactly as expected. Human weapons were primitive by convergent standards, chemically propelled projectiles, rudimentary directed energy systems, short-range missiles with comparatively simple guidance. The outer defensive platforms were destroyed in under 4 hours. The human ships engaged briefly, took catastrophic casualties, and withdrew. 7 of their 43 vessels survived the initial engagement. Those 7 broke formation and fled in 7 different directions. "They're running," said the tactical officer aboard the flagship, "dispersing, probably attempting to survive to carry news back to other population centers." This was entered into the tactical log as confirmation of expected prey species behavior under pressure. The fleet continued its approach toward the homeworld. What nobody aboard the fleet realized, what Solon herself did not realize until she had spent 6 weeks assembling sensor data from the outer pickets and cross-referencing the timing, was that the 7 surviving human ships had not fled at random. Each one had gone to a precise location, pre-calculated, pre-designated. They were not running. They were delivering something. "What did they deliver?" Davin asked when she showed him this. "I don't know yet," she said. "The outer picket sensors were too distant for fine detail." He looked at the sensor map, at the 7 precise trajectories radiating outward from the battle site. "They look like they're going to specific coordinates." "Yes," she said. "But those coordinates don't correspond to any human installations we charted." "No," she said, "they don't." He looked at her. "So either we missed installations during our survey period, or they built them after we issued the consolidation order," she said. "In the 14 months the fleet was in transit." He was quiet. "Davin," she said, very carefully, What can you build in 14 months if you know exactly what's coming and you're willing to completely restructure your industrial capacity to do it? He didn't answer. He walked to the window and stood there looking at nothing. That's what they were coordinating, she said. When we thought they were trying to form a military coalition, they were reorganizing their entire civilization's production capacity, not to build ships, not to build weapons, to build something else. What? He said. I don't know yet, she said, but the fleet didn't start dying until day 7. Days 4, 5, and 6 were unremarkable by Convergence tactical standards. The fleet reduced several of the outer orbital stations, absorbed a second wave of human missile attacks that were somewhat more coordinated than expected but still well within modeled parameters, and began establishing a stable approach corridor toward the homeworld. There were casualties. Every engagement had casualties, but they fell within acceptable projections. Morale aboard the fleet was high. The math still worked. On day 7, 3 Convergence vessels went silent within a 6-hour window. Not destroyed, silent. No explosion, no emergency beacon, no final transmission, just silence. This happened at the edge of the asteroid belt that ran through the outer region of the human system. 3 ships, Vossaren had written in the personal log recovered later. Just gone. We've sent scouts into the belt to look for debris. They're finding nothing, no wreckage. It's as if the ships simply left the formation and went somewhere else. Admiral Murrath has ordered 2 full destroyer wings into the belt for sweep operations. The sweep is ongoing. I don't want to write what I'm thinking. What I'm thinking is not rational. The scout ships sent into the belt were never heard from again. It was the crops that came back to Solin's mind at 300 on a morning 42 days into her reconstruction, waking her from sleep. She lay in the dark and thought about the crops. More food than their population would need for several growing seasons, planted in the middle of an impending alien invasion. And then she thought about the 14 months of industrial reorganization. And then she thought about the fact that, in all the signal traffic from the human homeworld during the fleet's approach, she had never once intercepted a message expressing doubt. Not one transmission from any political entity, any military command, any civilian broadcast, expressing doubt about the outcome. Not hope, not courage, specifically not doubt. She'd cataloged that earlier as a communications control strategy, the leadership suppressing negative sentiment to maintain civilian morale. She understood now that she had been wrong. They weren't suppressing doubt, they didn't have any. The question that had been evading her for 42 days arrived all at once, fully formed and cold. What did the humans know about our fleet that we didn't know they knew? The answer arrived in pieces over the following week, and each piece was worse. Piece 1. Buried in the 40-year archive of intercepted human communications, Solin found a document type she had previously dismissed as cultural noise, something humans produced called a asterisk novel asterisk, a long form of fictional narrative, apparently a primary method by which they processed, shared, and experimented with hypothetical scenarios. The Convergence's original survey team had collected thousands of them. They had been categorized as entertainment and given low analytical priority. Solin began reading them. The Convergence had first appeared in human fiction 22 years ago, not by name, but the shape of it, a multi-species interstellar collective expanding through territorial consolidation, absorbing or eliminating civilizations that could not resist, appeared in their fiction with enough accuracy to be striking. They had imagined the Convergence before they knew it existed. They had imagined what it would want. They had imagined how it would arrive. They had imagined with uncomfortable precision what kind of fleet it would send. And then, in story after story, they had imagined how to defeat it. Not from a position of technological superiority, never that. From a position of knowing the territory better. From a position of willingness to absorb losses the attacker found unacceptable. from a position of doing things the attackers' models had not accounted for. Because the models were built on rational assumptions, and humans, when pressed, were not fully rational. Solon read through the night. By morning, she had the shape of something she did not want to have the shape of. Davin, she said when he arrived, they wrote it down. They wrote what down? How to beat us, she said. They wrote down in stories decades before we made contact every effective strategy for defeating a technologically superior consolidating force in their own home system. They did it because they had imagined us. And when we arrived, they already knew which of those stories had worked. He sat down slowly. They ran scenarios, she said. In fiction, thousands of them. Crowdsourced strategic thinking disguised as entertainment. And the 14 months we were in transit, they went back and found the scenarios that worked and they built them. He stopped. That's what we missed, she said. Not a weapons program, not a military alliance, a library. They used a library. The fleet's casualties escalated through days 8 to 12, in a pattern that the outer picket logs showed clearly in retrospect, though they had not been recognized as a pattern at the time. Convergence ships were not being destroyed in open battle. They were disappearing in specific locations, at specific intervals, in a sequence that Solon eventually mapped and stared at for a very long time before she understood what she was looking at. The losses were not random attrition, they were being herded. The fleet was being guided, gradually, incrementally, each disappearance creating a zone the fleet unconsciously moved away from, into a specific region of the inner system. The 43 human ships, the spread formation on day 1, mapping the fleet's psychology, not its position, learning which losses would push convergence vessels in which direction, building a channel through space that the fleet would choose to enter because every alternative felt more dangerous. 712 ships, guided by 43, into a location the humans had had 14 months to prepare. The asteroid belt wasn't a hiding place. The asteroid belt was the first gate. Vossaren's log covered the next several days in increasingly short entries. The scout ships hadn't found debris in the belt because there was no debris to find. The ships had been taken intact. Something in the belt had been designed to do that, to take ships intact. Solon couldn't determine the mechanism from the available data. She suspected she was not meant to determine it. Day 12, Vossaren wrote. We've lost 60 vessels, 60. I've been in 4 engagements and I have never written a number like that in a log. Admiral Murith has ordered a halt to the advance. We're holding position at the inner edge of the belt while command reviews options. I won't describe morale. What I will say is that this morning I watched a senior tactical officer sit down in the middle of the corridor and refuse to stand up again. Just sat there. Just sat there. Solon read this sentence several times. She thought about pain tolerance. She thought about something she had read once in a human medical document, intercepted years ago and filed under biological curiosity asterisk. Humans were among the most pain-tolerant biological organisms their survey teams had ever cataloged. Not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most durable in any conventional sense. But they could endure damage that would trigger involuntary neurological shutdown in most convergent species and continue functioning, continue making decisions, continue fighting. Their biology had been built, over millions of years of evolution, to refuse to stop. She looked at Vossaren's log entry again. I watched a senior tactical officer sit down in the middle of the corridor and refuse to stand up again. She thought that officer was convergence. That was what the math was doing to a convergence mind. And she thought about what the same situation was doing to human minds, what the math had been doing to human minds for months before the fleet even arrived. They had known a fleet of 712 ships was coming. They had known their 43 ships couldn't stop it in open battle. They had known people would die, a lot of people. They had planted crops anyway, and built their library into reality, and waited. What kind of mind does that? On day 14, the fleet attempted to withdraw. This was the detail that had cost Solon the most sleep. Not the losses, not the tactics, the withdrawal. Because the fleet had been able to withdraw, the path back out of the system was clear, unobstructed, perfectly available. Murith had made the right call. He had assessed the losses and made the right rational call. The fleet couldn't withdraw. Not because it was blocked, because every ship that turned to leave was picked off individually, one by one, at ranges and from angles that should have been impossible. Whatever weapon the humans had built in 14 months, the thing Solon still couldn't identify from the recovered sensor data. It was not a weapon designed to destroy. It was a weapon designed to prevent retreat, to make withdrawal more expensive than advance, to make the rational choice irrational. They engineered a situation, Solon said quietly. In the darkened room on the night she finally understood, where the only viable option was to go forward. She thought about the stories. She thought about a species that had spent decades writing fictional scenarios about how to defeat overwhelmingly superior forces, about the ones that worked. The ones that worked had never been about winning the battle. They had been about making the battle a choice the attacker couldn't survive either way. Davin, she said the next morning. He was already there. He'd been arriving earlier and earlier, she noticed, as if staying away felt unsafe. They didn't try to win, she said. That's what I keep getting wrong. I keep analyzing this as if they were trying to win a military engagement. They weren't. They were trying to make continuing cost more than stopping. He looked at her, his face was doing something complicated. But we sent a fleet, we don't stop. Yes, she said, they knew that too. She let that sit. So what was the point? He said finally, and she could hear something raw underneath the question. If they knew we wouldn't stop, what was the point of all of it? Every ship we lose can't be used on the next world, she said. Every soldier we lose can't be deployed for the next consolidation. Whatever we spent here, we can never use anywhere else. She paused. They weren't trying to save themselves, Davin. They were trying to save everyone who comes after them. The room was very quiet. The crops, she said softly, the crops aren't for their own population. They knew what was going to happen to their population. The crops are for whoever survives the engagement on the planet's surface. Whoever's left after. She stopped. They farmed for their survivors before the battle happened because they knew exactly what the battle was going to cost them, and they did it anyway. She couldn't continue speaking for a moment. She had not expected this, had not expected to reach this particular understanding, had not built any professional or emotional structure to hold it. They accepted the cost, she said finally. In advance. They decided what they were willing to lose before the fleet even arrived, and then they spent 14 months building the most expensive possible weapon system that would extract maximum attrition from us regardless of outcome. How many survived? Davin asked. It was barely a whisper. On the planet after. Current estimates suggest, she said, between 60 and 70%. He closed his eyes. They saved 60 to 70% of their world, she said, by accepting the other 30 to 40 in advance, mathematically, deliberately. The fleet was destroyed over a period of 19 days. This is not precise. There may have been survivors in the outer system for weeks afterward, convergence vessels that had fled into deep space before the weapon's effective range caught them, who simply never found their way home. What the outer picket logs confirmed was that on day 31 after the fleet's arrival, there was no further signal from any convergence vessel within the human system. No transponder, no emergency beacon, no transmission, just silence. And then 11 light-years away an object arrived, warm, the size of a fist, with Solon's own markings on it. Solon's final report, the one she filed 11 weeks after the object's arrival, was 73 pages long. The executive summary was 9 words. We cannot send another fleet. They have not moved. The humans had not pursued, had not expanded, had not transmitted victory broadcasts or territorial demands or political overtures. They had, as far as the outer picket sensors could determine, gone back to their planet and begun the work of rebuilding. The crops were being harvested. The final mystery, the one Solon could not resolve, the one she came back to in the last paragraph of her report and admitted openly that she could not resolve, was the object itself. The fist-sized piece of hull plating, warm after 11 light years, with her own markings on it. Who had sent it? Why? It wasn't a threat. If humans wanted to threaten the convergence, they had demonstrated the capability to do so in terms that required no symbolic gestures. It wasn't a trophy, they'd kept everything else. It was, Solon eventually concluded, a message, but not a message directed at the convergence's military command or political leadership. Directed at her, specifically, from someone who had known about the old tradition of pressing markings into hull plating, which meant someone who had read her personnel file, or intercepted her personal communications, or, and this was the thought she kept returning to, the thought she could not dismiss, someone who had simply known, in the same way they seemed to have known so many things, and waited for the right moment to use the knowledge. The message, as she interpreted it, was this: we know who made the decision. We know who wrote the assessment. We are not asking for an apology. We are not asking for peace. We are not asking for anything. We are simply letting you know that we know and that we are still here, and that if you send another fleet, we have had 11 months to improve on what we built. Do the math. She filed the report. She walked out of the building. She stood in the open air of the station's exterior promenade and looked out at the stars, and thought about a species that had spent millions of years evolving the capacity to endure damage and keep moving, that had spent centuries writing stories about how to survive the impossible, that had spent 14 months building those stories into physical reality, that had accepted a 30 to 40% casualty rate among their own people, decided, calculated, accepted. And she thought about what the math meant going forward, not for humanity, for everyone else. The convergence had 400 years of expansion, 400 years of consolidation, of absorbed civilizations, of territories that had bent and complied and eventually disappeared into the collective. 400 years during which the math had always worked. The math had stopped working at a small, wet, unremarkable planet 11 light years from here, because something had lived there for long enough to learn how not to stop. Not how to win, how not to stop. The stars were very bright tonight. She had never found them beautiful before. She found them beautiful now, in a way that was inseparable from fear, because she was looking at them and thinking about how many small, wet, unremarkable planets there were in the galaxy, how many species that the models said couldn't resist, how many that might have been, in some dark back room on some forgotten world, writing stories. The greatest fleet the convergence had assembled in 400 years. One piece of hull the size of a fist, warm as a living thing. She understood the message now, not the words of it, the shape of it, the thing it was actually communicating, underneath everything else, underneath the implied warning and the specific knowledge and the impossible warmth. You never understood what we were. You modeled our weapons and our ships and our political systems and our biology, and you missed the only thing that mattered. You missed what we do with our fear. You missed what we build in the dark when the worst thing imaginable is coming and we know we can't stop it. You missed the part where we do it anyway. You missed that every species you ever absorbed gave up, not because they were weak, but because giving up was rational, and rational is something we have never fully managed to be. You missed that we don't experience the end of hope the way you do. You experience it as a stopping point. We experience it as a starting gun. Solon stood on the promenade for a long time. She did not recommend a second fleet. She never